Voices interview. Emmett's going to be talking to us today about peoplehood and the intersection of peoplehood and their various identities. Emmett, would you like to introduce yourself and talk about your identities and where you come from?
Sure. I'm Emmett, as you said. Um, I live outside of Boston, Massachusetts, on Massachusetts Agawam and Pawtucket land, uh, and I am queer, trans, non-binary, and autistic, to name a few. I
Yeah,
also really like to read books.
right. That's fair. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your Judaism?
Sure. So I grew up in a really weird synagogue. It was the only synagogue in the town I grew up in, and so we had conservative services 3 weeks out of the month and a reform service on the fourth, um, which I now understand is not normal, but at the time I thought this was just how synagogue worked. These days, I tend to identify as liturgically conservative and philosophically reconstructionist-ish. But I'm still definitely exploring and figuring out what resonates with me.
Right. Okay. So for the Kaplanian intersection here, we're going to touch a lot about peoplehood. And I think this is why you're a really great person to talk about peoplehood with. You know, Kaplan thought about Judaism as a civilization, and he thought that a big part of being in a civilization means that some people interact with and intersect with Judaism in different ways, depending on who they are, where they come from, and what point of time we exist in. And I'm wondering how that overlap of your identities affects the ease in which you access certain spaces and move through them, and what experiences you've had that were either difficult or impossible to access due to who you are.
Yeah, a lot of normative Jewish spaces are really hard for me to access for a variety of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the way that my autism works, I
Mm-hmm.
do fine in one-on-one conversations, but as you're aware, Judaism is very fond of large gatherings of people, which tend to be a lot harder for me to manage, especially informal social settings. So, the usual kiddish luncheon or oneg after Kabbalat Shabbat is kind of a nightmare for me because I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I mean, I intellectually understand that I'm supposed to be just chatting with people, but that's not a thing that my brain does very easily. Um, I also, because of my queer identities, I tend to struggle a lot with gender separations. So,
Mm-hmm.
as an example, my synagogue, which is in Lexington, Massachusetts, and is fairly open to queer identities, still has a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I don't
Right.
feel comfortable joining either of those groups because I am neither male nor female. I don't really belong in a brotherhood or a sisterhood. But then a lot of the, social happenings at the synagogue are led by the brotherhood or led by the sisterhood. And I just feel really awkward about that because I don't feel like I belong in those spaces. My synagogue luckily does have gender neutral restrooms, which helps me out a lot because then I
Mm-hmm.
don't have to think about where I'm going to the bathroom at least. Um, but there are just a lot of Judaism is gender segregated, and it's really
Mm-hmm.
hard for me to engage in those practices and even just figure out how I want to engage in them. Um, my rabbi and I are working on my dad was Jewish, my mom is not Jewish, and so we're working on an affirmation of Jewish identity because I go to a conservative synagogue and matrilineal descent is an important thing for them. And one of the things that my rabbi brought up was whether or not I want to do a Hatafat Dam Brit
Mm-hmm.
as part of my affirmation. And right now the answer is I don't really know yet. Um, but like so many other Jewish practices, that is a very gendered thing, and there isn't really a concept in Judaism of non-binaryhood in the way that I wish it existed.
Yeah, that is definitely complicated that we have all these different genders in the Talmud, and yet they are still distinctly gendered. There is no way to somehow opt out. But on the other hand, I know that you are involved in the Trans Halacha project to some extent, and we've met in digital spaces that are actively involved in making Judaism welcoming for neurodivergent people, for trans people. Would you like to talk a little bit about the difference between some of those online spaces that are catering towards these identities versus dealing with in real life spaces that are maybe a bit more normative?
Sure. Yeah, so you and I met through, I think it was Svara originally, and I
Hmm.
think we've also done some stuff with Shelma Allah, which is another online yeshiva, and both of them are very queer centric. They're built around queer folks, which is really great, first of all, because there's nothing quite like going into a Jewish space full of other people who are like you. The first time I went to a Trans Halacha project gathering, it was a bunch of trans and non-binary Jews hanging out and being non-binary and trans together. And I had never experienced that before. It was a really beautiful, wonderful moment. Um, and then even the spaces that they curate that are not specifically designed for trans and non-binary folks, everyone's still very aware of the complexities of gender. And so the instructors and the students are really careful to talk about gender as a nuanced concept. So, if we're discussing a passage in Torah or Talmud that deals with gender explicitly, we can acknowledge that this is part of our tradition and we want to discuss it while also acknowledging that it's not that simple and that there are nuances that these texts may not get at. Um, and I think that's really important to me, just acknowledging that the texts that we have are important and are deeply meaningful, but may not have nuance in the ways that we need them to in order for us to feel connected to Judaism. So leaving space for that nuance, I think, is really important.
Yeah. You also find that it's empowering in the sense that it gives you a place in the Jewish people to be able to contribute your own liturgy or art or perspective on the Talmud.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we were talking about nuance, and I love those spaces partially because we're all being queer about it together. I think I was in a class recently where I heard God referred to by three different genders over the course of a 2-hour class period. And everyone just sort of rolled with it because, like, that's the space that we're in where we can read our own identities into these texts in the same way that Jews have for generations. But the Jews that have been doing it for generations have been predominantly men.
Hmm.
And so being able for us, us being able to read ourselves into those texts, I think is really crucial, and has really been empowering for me, and helps me feel like those texts can be part of my identity, even if they don't explicitly acknowledge my identity in themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there other like spaces or pieces of literature or particular figures that you want to mention in terms of helping you take ownership of your Judaism and how that allows you to be able to empower yourself and your peoplehood?
So one of my favorite uh, physical Jewish spaces actually is a mikveh nearby called Mayim Chaim. Um, and it's actually the mikveh that I'm going to be going to for my affirmation. And my rabbi has reached out to them and said, we would prefer either a transmasculine or a non-binary mikveh guide. And they have said, yes, we have mikveh guides of all genders available, and we are absolutely available to accommodate that request. Um, so, there are a lot of really wonderful spaces that are working on these issues and trying to make it possible for Jews of a variety of genders and a variety of life experiences to be able to access really important aspects of Jewish tradition.
That's awesome. When it comes to, spaces that are trying to become more progressive or trying to become more inclusive, which I think is a challenge that a lot of spaces that are either centrist or progressive leaning are trying to struggle with right now and grapple with, how do you think they can be able to achieve this in a way that really helps allow people like yourself thrive, not just feel tolerated, but actually be able to feel fully present in the community?
I mean, I think the first step is to ask.
Hmm.
Um, you know, Trans, autistic, neurodivergent, disabled, non-white, like you and I are both white, so let's name that, right? Like
Hmm.
Jews of color, like we're out there, we all exist. ask
Mhm.
us what makes us feel comfortable or uncomfortable in their spaces. Um, there's a saying that I think gets applied to a lot of different groups, but I especially love it for autism, which is if you've met one autistic person, you have met one autistic person, right? Like all Jews are different, all autistic people are different, all trans people are different. Um, so I think asking and listening really deeply to what people have to say is the first really important step. Um, and then sort of approaching it from a space of possibility. I like looking at Judaism as a space of like, how can we do this? How
Mhm.
can we include everyone? How can we allow everyone to thrive? How can we open new avenues for people to engage? I think the pandemic, as much as it was terrible and bad for everyone around the world, has also opened up a really beautiful opportunity for a lot of folks in that people who are homebound can now access synagogue spaces in a way they never could before because synagogues are streaming services, right? So I think that's the attitude we need to have is like how can we be as inclusive as possible rather than starting from the point of view of this is what we do, how do we modify it, right? Instead approaching it from the standpoint of what could we do differently or in addition or how can we imagine a different world that is better for everyone and then create it together?
Yeah. And that definitely resonates with me because personally, what started my discovery towards a Judaism that was more fit for me was the fact that synagogues became much more accessible overnight during the pandemic. I was able to finally access, a non-conservative synagogue because suddenly I could just go online and take my pick. I could actually go shul shopping just by living in a small city. It was so exciting.
Absolutely. And, for me, another way that my autism manifests is I'm really bad at having a normal sleep schedule.
Hmm.
There have been studies that found that neurodivergent folks often have a shifted circadian rhythm, and I
Yeah.
am one of those people. So going to morning services at 7 in the morning is not a thing that I'm capable of doing. But, there are synagogues in California, and they have services at 7 in the morning, and it's actually 10 my time, right? So that's opened up a whole new world for me where I can actually potentially attend daily services, which I couldn't have done if I needed to go at a specific time when my body just wasn't willing to be awake yet.
Yes, that's also a really good point, is that you now have the capability, no matter where you are in the world or what your body or mind state is, to be able to do services, which is incredible.
Exactly.
One thing that I'm curious about, and I'm wondering what you think about this though, is I've seen some synagogues retract some of the services that they're offering because they have this attitude that the pandemic is over, or that they put the services out there. For example, they're trying to cater to Jews of color, for example, or queer Jews, and they see that nobody's showing up. And so they just stop offering these services. What do you think of this approach? And do you think it's misguided? Do you think there's a different way that they should be doing this? Like, what's going on here? Because I see it happen
So
often.
yeah, and I think it really depends on the synagogue.
Hmm.
If they're spending a lot of resources on creating a service that no one is taking advantage of and they can see that, right? We can see how many people use a stream or sign on to a Zoom. If that's a waste of resources for them, I think it's reasonable for them to consider stopping that practice.
Hmm.
With that being said, you know, even if there's only one person who's signing into your synagogue, it may be a real lifeline for that person. There are Jews with mobility issues who can't leave their homes, and the pandemic being over doesn't change that for them.
Oh, absolutely.
Not to mention that for many disabled folks, and especially immunocompromised folks, the pandemic is not over by any stretch of the imagination. I have a friend who still can't go out in public without being really careful about it and masking and being outside because she's immunocompromised. And the pandemic is probably never going to be over for her.
Yeah.
So, I think it's important to keep the people that genuinely can't make it to an in-person service in mind. Um, it's tough because in Judaism we think so much about community, and that is really important to me. I've started going back to Friday night services in person, and it's been a really important thing in my life. Um, but I'm privileged to be able to do that. And I think it's really important that even the folks who aren't able to access that in that specific way can still access Jewish services. I don't think every synagogue needs to be doing that in order for it to work.
Mhm.
But I think generally speaking,
Mhm.
if synagogues have the resources and it's not a big strain for them to continue offering it online, I don't see any reason for them to stop. Who does it hurt?
Yeah. I guess my other question as well, to kind of tie into what you were saying about listening to people and being able to offer services to those who need them so that we can be able to build community with the people around us instead of, leaving them without spaces, is what do you feel that neurotypical or heteronormative Jews could learn by engaging with neurodivergent and queer Jews? What misconceptions do you think they have about us?
Just so many,
Okay.
Caitlin, so many. I don't there are certainly a lot of things that I think neurotypical and cis hetero Jews could learn from somebody like me about my identities. But I think there's also a lot that they can learn from people like me, and a lot that I, for example, have learned from Jews of color
Mhm.
about Judaism.
Absolutely.
Right? We have different ways of approaching Judaism and different ways of thinking about being Jewish. The ways that the Trans Halacha Project, for example, thinks about something like Nida, like the monthly trip to the mikveh. Um, I think asking the question, like, can a trans man perform Nida? What about a trans woman? What does it mean for each of those people to perform Nida? What about for a non-binary person? Um, what about somebody who has had surgery and had their uterus removed? Which doesn't just apply to trans folks, also applies to, my mom had a hysterectomy when she was giving birth to me because of complications in the birth. Um, Admittedly, my mother is not Jewish, but if she were, I imagine maybe she would want to ask, like, could she still perform the monthly ritual of Nida? And what would it mean for her if she could or if she couldn't? So, I think there's a real expansion of what Judaism can mean and what Jewish practices can mean that we can only really see when we step outside of the view that we've had on Judaism since we were born. So for me, a lot of that has come from listening to Jews of color or listening to, I'm a trans man, but listening to trans feminine Jews has
Mhm.
really opened my eyes to a lot of different sides of things that I hadn't considered. Um, so I think it's not just about learning about our identities, although that is certainly valuable. I think there's more to Judaism than a bunch of white cis heteronormative people can imagine without opening up and listening to Jews who don't fall into that category of people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have any other thoughts about, especially because you were mentioning being affiliated with conservative synagogues, is it sometimes difficult as a non-binary person straddling the line between wanting traditional liturgy and having it feel authentic, but then also wanting to have non-binary Hebrew somehow involved so that it feels gender affirming?
Yeah, and for me, the choice that I've made is to just roll with traditional Hebrew and
Mhm.
forget about it. But that doesn't work for everybody, and I definitely have conflicted feelings about using masculine language to refer to God, for example, or to refer to myself. Um, I kind of do a little bit of mental juggling and and shrug about it and move on. Um, I think there are a lot of Reform and Reconstructionist synagogues that are doing really great things with introducing non-binary like the non-binary Hebrew project language into their services. There's a great online Siddur that has full-on non-binary language for everybody in it, and that's great. I think it's important that just like we have a multiplicity of Judaisms available for cis heteronormative folks, I think we also need a multiplicity of Judaisms available for people like me, because as I said, right, like everyone's different, and what works for me isn't necessarily going to work for anybody else. Um, but you're definitely right. I often joke with my friends about how if I ever went to an Orthodox shul, I would have to sit on top of the mechitza. And like I say that jokingly, but it's also genuinely painful sometimes.
Mhm.
I can never go to an Orthodox synagogue and feel like myself regardless of how I engage in that synagogue. That's also true of like a place like a Chabad house, right? I can
Hmm.
never access those resources without either lying about my identity or hiding it somehow, right? Like I can't,
Hmm.
it's not something I'm able to access. So, I think along with what folks can learn and how to be uh, welcoming to people that are not like you, I think one of the things that's really important is to be aware that there can be a lot of pain and a lot of harm that people are carrying with them. We can laugh and joke about it, and it is sometimes funny to talk about like, oh, like I'd literally be sitting on the mechitza while I was praying, ha ha ha. Um, but there's also, like I said, there's some genuine pain there, and real loss.
Hmm.
So I think that's another thing for everyone to be aware of, and that I try to be aware of when I'm talking to other Jews who are not like me, especially Jews of color, is that there may be some real pain and harm that those folks are carrying with them as well, especially when we're talking about how we access Jewish spaces and how we may not be comfortable doing so.
Yeah, that's definitely something that resonates with me because I find oftentimes when we talk about Jewish trauma, there's a lot of focus on the type of trauma that Ashken normative Jews have faced, especially because of the Holocaust, which is absolutely valid. But I find that a lot of modern Jews, especially Jews that are our age or a little bit older, struggle with issues related to fitting into spaces based on various identities we carry that we either have to hide or cannot obscure, and therefore we face expulsion from our communities.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. We need to hold both of those things, right? Like
Mhm.
this isn't a race. It's not like whose trauma is worse.
Yeah.
We're all broken people in a variety of ways, and we need to honor that and be gentle about it with each other whenever we can.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to mention or like to any spaces you'd like to promote? Anything you'd like to say before we finish the interview?
I mean, listen, I will always plug the Transhalacha project with
Yeah.
which folks can find by Googling for it. We actually recently put out the Transhalacha project put out a set of responsa from a variety of trans Jews talking about trans Jewish issues. So those are really cool. There's also I forget what it's called, but there's a book of blessings and prayers and rituals that trans Jews have contributed to, which you can also find with the Transhalacha project. And then there's always Svara and Shalma Allah, which are my two favorite online yeshivot, and I will be singing their praises forever and ever. So
Uh,
I think those are my top three resources that I would encourage people to check out.
I will give that my extra. Thank you very much, Emmett.